Marcus Johnson stood on the sidewalk of Oakwood Heights, an upscale neighborhood with historic homes and manicured lawns. The 16-year-old adjusted his camera lens, focusing on the interesting architecture of a Victorian-style house across the street. He wore his school backpack and a lanyard with his student ID from Washington High School. The late afternoon sun cast perfect light on the detailed trim work of the old homes. "This will be perfect for my project," Marcus said to himself as he snapped several photos. His AP photography teacher had assigned them to capture historical elements in modern settings, and this neighborhood was famous for its well-preserved homes from the early 1900s. From behind her living room curtains, Karen Whitfield watched the teenager with growing concern. She had lived in Oakwood Heights for 15 years and prided herself on knowing everyone who belonged there. This boy was not from around here. She noticed him taking pictures of different houses, including hers, and immediately felt uncomfortable. "He's definitely not from this neighborhood," Karen muttered to herself, twisting her pearl necklace nervously. What is he really doing with those photos? Marcus moved to the next house, unaware he was being watched. He checked his photo list and made some notes in his project journal. His teacher had emphasized the importance of documenting the historical elements they photographed, so Marcus carefully wrote down details about each home's style and estimated age. Karen decided to step outside. She opened her front door and called out, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" Marcus looked up, surprised by the sharp tone. "Hello, ma'am. I'm taking photos for my school project. It's about historical architecture." Karen crossed her arms and frowned. "Which school? Why this neighborhood? How did you get here?" "Washington High. I'm in AP photography," Marcus replied politely, showing his school ID. "My mom dropped me off. This neighborhood has perfect examples of Victorian and colonial revival architecture." Karen didn't step closer to look at his ID. Her lips tightened into a thin line. "I haven't seen any car drop you off. I've been watching." Marcus felt a knot forming in his stomach. He had experienced this kind of suspicion before. "My mom dropped me off about 30 minutes ago at the corner of Maple and Oak. She's picking me up at 5:30 when she finishes work." "That's very convenient," Karen said, her voice dripping with doubt. "What's your name?" "Marcus Johnson, ma'am." He tried to keep his voice steady, remembering his mother's advice to always stay calm and respectful in uncomfortable situations. Karen pulled out her phone. "Well, Marcus, I'm going to call the neighborhood watch. We've had break-ins recently, and I don't recognize you." "Ma'am, I'm just taking pictures for school." "See?" Marcus held up his camera and project notes, but Karen had already stepped back toward her porch. Instead of calling the neighborhood watch, Karen dialed 911. She turned her back to Marcus and spoke in a hushed but urgent tone. "Yes, there's a suspicious young man taking pictures of homes in Oakwood Heights. He's black, maybe 16 or 17, wearing a blue hoodie and jeans. He claims he's a student, but I've never seen him before. He's photographing all the houses, including security features." Marcus overheard enough to realize she was calling the police. His heart raced, but he took a deep breath. He had done nothing wrong. He decided to continue his project while waiting, moving to the next house on the block. Running would only make him look guilty. 10 minutes later, a police car turned onto the street. Marcus felt his phone vibrate in his pocket, a text from his mom checking in. He wanted to call her but decided to wait and see how the situation with the police would unfold. He had his school ID, his project assignment sheet, and his camera full of architecture photos. Surely that would be enough to clear up this misunderstanding. The police car pulled to the curb. 2 officers stepped out, one older with graying hair and one younger. Karen immediately walked toward them, pointing at Marcus. "That's him," she said loudly. "He's been going up and down the street for almost an hour." Marcus stood still, his camera hanging around his neck, waiting for what would happen next. He didn't know that this uncomfortable moment would soon lead to Karen Whitfield's biggest embarrassment, one that would change not just her afternoon, but her entire perspective. Officer James Miller, a 15-year veteran of the force, approached Marcus with his hand resting casually on his belt. The younger officer, Kevin Santos, walked toward Karen to get her statement. Marcus remained where he stood, keeping his hands visible beside his camera. "Good afternoon, young man," Officer Miller said, his tone professional but not unfriendly. Mind telling me what you're doing in this neighborhood today? Yes, sir, Marcus replied, speaking clearly and calmly just as his mother had taught him. I'm working on my AP photography project for school. We're documenting historical architecture in the city. Marcus slowly reached for his backpack. I can show you my assignment sheet and ID, if that helps. Go ahead, but move slowly, Officer Miller instructed, watching carefully. Marcus pulled out a folder containing his project guidelines and his student ID. He handed them to the officer, who reviewed the papers with interest. Washington High, huh? My nephew goes there, Officer Miller commented, examining the school letterhead on the assignment paper. Mrs. Daniels still teaching photography? Marcus felt his shoulders relax slightly. Yes, sir, she's my teacher. Meanwhile, Karen was giving her version of events to Officer Santos with animated gestures. He's been taking pictures of every house, including security cameras and entrance points, she insisted. I've never seen him in this neighborhood before, and I know everyone who belongs here. Officer Santos took notes. And what exactly did he say when you questioned him? He claimed to be a student doing some project, Karen said dismissively. But anyone could make up that story, and why would a school send students to photograph private homes without permission from homeowners? Back with Marcus, Officer Miller was scrolling through the photos on Marcus's camera with his permission. These are actually pretty good, Miller commented, looking at close-ups of decorative moldings and ornate doorways. You got a good eye for detail. Thank you, sir, Marcus replied. I'm hoping to study photojournalism in college. Officer Miller handed back the camera. So how did you choose this neighborhood specifically? A few neighbors had noticed the police car and began to gather at a distance, watching with curiosity. Among them was Mr. Grayson, an elderly man who lived across the street. What's going on here? Mr. Grayson called out, walking slowly toward them with his cane. Is there a problem? Officer Santos turned to address him. Just checking on a report, sir. Nothing to worry about. If it's about this young man, I've seen him taking pictures all afternoon, Mr. Grayson said. Very polite when I asked what he was doing. Showed me his school ID and everything. Karen's face flushed red. Well, I've never seen him before, and he was photographing my house without permission. Officer Santos approached Officer Miller, and they spoke quietly for a moment. Marcus stood patiently, occasionally checking his phone. Is everything all right? Officer Miller asked, noticing Marcus's concern. Yes, sir. Just wondering if I should call my mom. She worries. Officer Miller nodded. Feel free to make that call if you'd like. Marcus stepped a few feet away and dialed his mother's number. Karen watched with narrowed eyes as he spoke into the phone. Hey, Mom. Yeah, I'm still at Oakwood Heights, Marcus said, his voice even. Actually, something happened. Someone called the police because I was taking pictures. He listened for a moment. No, everything's fine. The officers are being very reasonable. They're just doing their job. Another pause. No, you don't need to leave work. I'm okay, really. I can explain when. Marcus stopped mid-sentence, listening intently to his mother's response. His expression changed slightly, but he kept his composure. Okay, if you're sure. I'll be right here, he said before hanging up. The officers had finished conferring and approached Marcus again. Officer Miller had a slight smile on his face. Well, Marcus, your story checks out. You're obviously here for a legitimate school project. Karen stepped forward indignantly. So you're just going to let him continue? What if he's casing these houses for a robbery later? Officer Santos turned to her with a professional but firm tone. Ma'am, we have no reason to believe this young man is doing anything illegal. His documentation is in order, and he has a witness who corroborates his story. Karen was about to protest further when Marcus spoke up calmly. Officers, my mother is actually on her way here now. She said she'd like to talk to everyone involved. Fine, Karen said, crossing her arms. I'd like to meet this mother who lets her son wander around taking pictures of strangers' homes. Little did Karen know that in approximately 20 minutes, she would regret those words more than almost anything she had ever said in her life. The next 15 minutes passed with growing tension. Karen refused to return to her home, insisting on staying to see this through. More neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, some filming with their phones, others whispering among themselves. Marcus stood quietly, occasionally checking his camera settings to keep his hands busy. I still think you should check his ID more carefully, Karen said to Officer Miller, her voice rising. Those school IDs can be faked, you know. My friend's son works in security. Officer Miller sighed. Ma'am, we verified his identity. There's no reason for further concern. Karen's face reddened. Well, I'm concerned. This is a safe neighborhood, and we need to keep it that way. A jogger slowed down as she passed the scene. She was a black woman in her 40s, dressed in bright running gear. Everything okay here? She asked, looking at Marcus with concern. Just a misunderstanding, ma'am. Officer Santos replied. The jogger didn't move on. I live 3 blocks over. I've seen this young man taking pictures before. He's working on a school project. Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh, of course you'd say that. Excuse me. The jogger stepped closer. What exactly does that mean? Officer Santos moved between them. Let's all stay calm here. Marcus took a deep breath. This was getting out of hand. He didn't want to be the center of a neighborhood dispute. Officers, I can just come back another day to finish my project. You shouldn't have to leave, the jogger said firmly. You're not doing anything wrong. Karen threw up her hands. This is ridiculous. Am I the only one who cares about safety anymore? For all we know, he could be working with others. Where exactly is this mother who's supposedly coming? As if on cue, the sound of a vehicle approaching caught everyone's attention. A black SUV with government plates turned onto the street, moving at a deliberate pace. It pulled to the curb directly behind the police car. The neighbors fell silent, watching as the driver's door opened. A tall woman in a crisp navy blue suit stepped out. She wore her hair in a neat bun, and dark sunglasses covered her eyes. She removed them as she approached, revealing a face that looked remarkably like an older, female version of Marcus. That's my mom, Marcus said quietly to Officer Miller. The woman walked with authority, her badge already visible on her belt. Both officers straightened their posture instinctively, recognizing the presence of federal law enforcement before she even spoke. Good afternoon, officers, she said, her voice calm but commanding. I'm Special Agent in Charge Vanessa Johnson, FBI Atlanta Field Office. She showed her credentials briefly. I understand there's a situation involving my son. Karen's mouth fell open. She stared at Agent Johnson, then at Marcus, then back at Agent Johnson. The color drained from her face. Officer Santos cleared his throat. Agent Johnson, there was a call about suspicious activity. When we arrived, we found your son taking photographs for a school project. We verified his identity and purpose here. Vanessa nodded, then turned to Marcus. Are you okay, honey? I'm fine, Mom, Marcus replied. Just a misunderstanding. Vanessa placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder before turning to face Karen, who was still frozen in shock. You must be the concerned citizen who called the police, Vanessa said, her tone professional but with an unmistakable edge. Karen struggled to find words. I was just. There have been break-ins and... I understand community safety concerns, Vanessa replied. I work in law enforcement after all. But what specifically about my son taking photographs for a clearly documented school project made you suspicious enough to call 911? The gathered neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh snap." Karen clutched her necklace. He was taking pictures of houses without permission. From public property, which is perfectly legal, Officer Miller pointed out gently. Would you have called if he were a different color? The jogger asked bluntly. Karen gasped. That's not fair. This isn't about race. Vanessa held up her hand, silencing everyone. I'd like to speak with the officers and this woman privately for a moment. She turned to Marcus. Why don't you continue your project down the block? I'll catch up with you. Marcus nodded, relieved to step away from the tension. As he walked away, he heard his mother say in her professional FBI voice, Now, let's have an honest conversation about what happened here today. The neighbors began to disperse, knowing the real drama was just beginning for Karen Whitfield. Vanessa Johnson led Karen and the 2 officers to a quiet spot under a large oak tree, away from the curious eyes of the remaining neighbors. Her face remained composed, but there was a controlled intensity in her eyes that made Karen shift uncomfortably. Before we begin, Vanessa said, her voice measured, I want to be clear that I'm speaking to you both as a mother and as a federal law enforcement officer with 20 years of experience. Karen swallowed hard, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood, she said weakly. Vanessa nodded. Let's examine that. What exactly did you observe my son doing that warranted calling emergency services? Karen hesitated, suddenly aware of how flimsy her reasoning sounded. He was taking pictures of different houses for a long time. Did he approach any doors, try to open any windows, peek into any homes? Vanessa asked. No, but did he harass or threaten anyone? No. Did he refuse to identify himself when you asked? Karen looked at her feet. No, he showed me his school ID, but I thought it might be fake. Officer Miller stepped in. Ma'am, if I may, your call reported a suspicious person possibly casing homes for burglary. That's a serious allegation. Based on photographs being taken from a public sidewalk, Vanessa added, in broad daylight, while wearing a school ID, with a project assignment in his backpack. Karen's face flushed red. There have been break-ins recently. I was being cautious. Have there actually been break-ins, Officer Santos? Vanessa asked. The younger officer looked uncomfortable. One reported theft from a vehicle 3 months ago, ma'am. Nothing involving home intrusion. Vanessa took a deep breath. Mrs. Whitfield. Ms. Whitfield, Karen corrected quietly. Ms. Whitfield, I deal with profiling cases professionally. What happened today is textbook racial profiling. Karen gasped. That's not fair. I would have called about anyone suspicious. Would you? Vanessa's voice remained calm, but her gaze was penetrating. If a white teenager with a camera had been doing exactly what Marcus was doing, would you have immediately assumed criminal intent? Karen opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Meanwhile, down the block, Marcus continued taking photos, trying to focus on his project despite the stressful situation. His phone buzzed with a text from his friend Jamal. Finished your photos yet? Want to meet up for basketball later? Marcus typed back. Got delayed. Police situation. Tell you later. Almost immediately, his phone rang. It was Jamal. Marcus answered with a sigh. Yo, what happened? Are you okay? Jamal's voice was filled with concern. I'm fine, Marcus said, keeping his voice low. Some lady called the cops because I was taking pictures for Mrs. Daniels' project. For real? Man, that's messed up, Jamal replied. Did they hassle you? Not really. The officers were actually pretty decent about it, Marcus admitted. Then Mom showed up. Jamal laughed. Oh snap, FBI Mom to the rescue. I bet that lady nearly passed out. Despite everything, Marcus smiled. Pretty much. Mom's talking to her now. Your mom is scary when she gets into agent mode, Jamal said. Remember when she caught us playing video games instead of studying for finals? Don't remind me, Marcus groaned. Listen, I gotta go. I'll call you later with the full story. After hanging up, Marcus noticed a young white couple watching him from their porch across the street. He tensed slightly, wondering if he was about to face another confrontation. Instead, the woman waved and called out, Are you with that photography project? The architecture one? Marcus nodded cautiously. Our house is from 1912, the man offered. Original stained glass in the front window if you want to photograph it. Thank you, Marcus said, surprised by the friendly offer. That would be great for my project. As Marcus approached their house, he glanced back toward where his mother was still engaged in intense conversation with Karen and the officers. Despite the uncomfortable situation, he felt a swell of pride. His mother had always taught him to handle difficult situations with dignity, just as she was doing now. Back under the oak tree, Vanessa was wrapping up her conversation. I'm not here to shame you, Ms. Whitfield, she said. But I do want you to understand the potential consequences of your actions today. Karen looked miserable. Are you going to file a complaint against me? Vanessa shook her head. No, but I want you to consider what could have happened if my son had reacted differently out of fear, or if the responding officers have been less reasonable. I didn't mean to cause trouble, Karen whispered. The conversation under the oak tree continued for another 10 minutes. Officer Santos kept glancing at his watch. aware that they had other calls waiting, but he didn't dare interrupt FBI agent in charge Johnson. Karen Whitfield stood with her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her face a mixture of embarrassment and defensiveness. "I'd like to propose a path forward," Vanessa said finally. "Officer Miller, Officer Santos, I appreciate your professional handling of this situation. I won't be filing any formal complaints about today's incident." Both officers nodded with visible relief. A complaint from an FBI agent in charge could have meant serious trouble for their department. "Ms. Whitfield," Vanessa continued, turning to face Karen directly, "I'd like to invite you to attend a community forum on neighborhood safety that the FBI is hosting next month. It addresses how communities can work together effectively without relying on harmful stereotypes." Karen blinked in surprise. This wasn't the punishment she had expected. I suppose I could attend," she stammered. "Excellent. I'll have the details sent to you," Vanessa said, her tone making it clear this wasn't really a request. She handed Karen her business card. "My direct line is on the back. I'd appreciate it if you'd confirm your attendance by next Friday." Karen took the card with trembling fingers. The FBI seal gleamed under the afternoon sun, making the reality of who she was dealing with impossible to ignore. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to check on my son," Vanessa said, effectively dismissing everyone. As she walked away, Karen turned to Officer Miller. "Is she always this intense?" Officer Miller suppressed a smile. "Ma'am, that was Agent Johnson being exceedingly polite. Trust me." Down the street, Marcus was finishing photographing the stained glass window when he saw his mother approaching. The young couple who owned the house waved at Vanessa. "Your mom's here," a woman said to Marcus. "Is that an FBI badge? That's so cool." Marcus nodded, used to this reaction. "She's been with the Bureau for 20 years. Vanessa approached with a warm smile that transformed her entire demeanor from stern federal agent to proud mother in an instant. "Getting some good shots, honey?" she asked, examining his camera screen. "Check out this stained glass," Marcus replied, showing her the photos. Original from 1912, according to the owners. Vanessa admired the photos with genuine interest. "Beautiful composition. Mrs. Daniels will be impressed." The couple introduced themselves as Ryan and Emma Collins, new homeowners in the neighborhood. "We're so sorry about what happened," Emma said, glancing toward Karen, who was still talking with the officers. "That's not representative of everyone here." "Thank you for being kind to my son," Vanessa replied sincerely. As they chatted, more neighbors began to approach. Word had spread quickly about what had happened, and about who Marcus's mother was. Several people offered to have their historic homes included in his photography project. Mrs. Hernandez, an elderly woman who lived in one of the oldest houses on the street, approached with a plate of cookies. "For the young photographer," she said, offering them to Marcus. "My house was built in 1895. The back garden has the original gazebo if you'd like to photograph it sometime." Mr. Grayson, the elderly man who had spoken up for Marcus earlier, joined them as well. "Agent Johnson, your son was nothing but respectful when I spoke to him earlier. You should be proud." "I am," Vanessa said, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. From a distance, Karen watched this scene unfold with growing discomfort. What she had intended as protection of her neighborhood had backfired completely. Now Marcus and his FBI mother were being treated like visiting celebrities by the very neighbors Karen had hoped to rally to her side. Officer Santos approached Karen one last time. "Ma'am, we're clearing the scene now. Do you need anything else from us?" Karen shook her head, unable to take her eyes off the gathering down the street. "No? Thank you for your time," she said mechanically. As the police car pulled away, Karen remained rooted to her spot, uncertain what to do next. She had lived in this neighborhood for 15 years and had always seen herself as a respected community leader. Now, in the span of an hour, she had become the villain in a story that would likely be told at neighborhood gatherings for years to come. She clutched Vanessa's business card tightly in her hand, knowing that her next decisions would determine whether this humiliating incident would become a permanent stain on her reputation or an opportunity for genuine growth. With a deep breath, Karen straightened her shoulders and began walking toward the growing group of neighbors surrounding Marcus and his mother. Karen walked slowly toward the growing group of neighbors surrounding Marcus and his mother. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her mind raced with possible things to say, but nothing seemed adequate. As she approached, conversations quieted, and several neighbors gave her cold looks. Vanessa noticed Karen's approach first. With a subtle shift in posture, the FBI agent returned to her professional demeanor. "Ms. Whitfield," Vanessa acknowledged her with a nod. "Did you need something else?" All eyes turned to Karen. Marcus lowered his camera, his expression guarded but not angry. The plate of cookies from Mrs. Hernandez was half empty, with Marcus having shared them with the neighborhood children who had gathered to see his photography. Karen's voice faltered. "I wanted to apologize to Marcus for jumping to conclusions." A tense silence followed. Even the children seemed to sense the importance of this moment. Vanessa looked at her son, giving him space to respond however he felt appropriate. Marcus studied Karen's face for a moment before speaking. "Thank you for saying that," he said quietly. "I was just trying to complete my assignment." Karen nodded, her eyes downcast. "I understand that now. I shouldn't have called the police." "No, you shouldn't have," agreed Emma Collins, crossing her arms. "Do you realize what could have happened?" Karen's face flushed with shame. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I just saw a black teenager and assumed the worst." Mr. Grayson finished for her, his voice sharp despite his advanced age. "That's not fair," Karen protested, though her voice lacked conviction. Vanessa raised her hand slightly, a gesture that immediately quieted everyone. Years of commanding FBI briefing rooms had given her that power. "Ms. Whitfield has acknowledged her mistake," Vanessa said evenly. "That's the first step." Karen looked at her gratefully, surprised to find an ally in the woman she had wronged most directly. "What I'd like to know," Vanessa continued, her tone shifting subtly, "is whether this is a learning moment or merely damage control." Karen blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "I don't understand what you mean," she replied hesitantly. "Let me be more clear," Vanessa said, stepping closer. "Are you sorry because my son turned out to be the son of an FBI agent, or are you sorry because you realized your assumptions about him were wrong?" The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. Several neighbors nodded in agreement with Vanessa's pointed inquiry. Karen struggled to find the right words. "Both, I suppose. I'm embarrassed about who you turned out to be, but I'm also ashamed of my reaction." Marcus, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened to me." All eyes turned to him, surprised by the calm certainty in his voice. "Usually it's security guards following me in stores, or people crossing the street when they see me coming," Marcus continued. "Mom taught me how to handle it. Stay calm. Be respectful. Keep your hands visible. But it still hurts every time." Karen's eyes filled with tears. "I never thought of myself as that kind of person." "Few people do," Vanessa said. "That's what makes bias so dangerous. It operates below the level of conscious thought." Mrs. Hernandez stepped forward, her kind face serious. "Karen, I've known you for 10 years. You've organized block parties and helped with my garden when my arthritis was bad. You're not a bad person, but what you did today was wrong." Karen nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "The question is," Vanessa said, "what happens next?" Before Karen could answer, Ryan Collins spoke up. "I have an idea. The neighborhood association meeting is next week. Maybe we could use this as a starting point for a larger conversation about community safety and inclusivity." Several neighbors murmured in agreement. "I think that's an excellent suggestion," Vanessa said. "And if the association is agreeable, I'd be happy to share some resources from our community outreach program." Karen took a deep breath. "I'm the secretary of the association. I can put it on the agenda." For the first time, Vanessa gave Karen a genuine smile. That would be a positive step forward. Marcus, who had been quietly taking in the conversation, lifted his camera again. "Would it be okay if I took a few more photos before we go, Mom? I still need some examples of colonial revival architecture." "Of course, honey," Vanessa replied. Karen hesitated, then said, "My house is colonial revival style. The porch columns are original to the 1920s building. You're welcome to photograph them, if you want." Marcus looked at her thoughtfully, then nodded. "Thank you. That would be helpful for my project." As Marcus adjusted his camera settings and walked toward Karen's house, the neighbors began to disperse. The neighborhood slowly returned to its usual peaceful state as most residents went back to their homes. Marcus took several detailed photos of Karen's porch columns, working with careful concentration as if the earlier conflict had never happened. His ability to refocus on his project despite the emotional afternoon impressed Karen, who watched from a respectful distance. Vanessa stood nearby, occasionally checking her phone for work messages, but primarily observing the interaction between her son and the woman who had called the police on him. Years of FBI training had taught her to read people well, and she could see genuine regret in Karen's body language. When Marcus finished, he reviewed the images on his camera display and nodded with satisfaction. "Thank you, Ms. Whitfield. These will be perfect for my project section on colonial revival architecture." "You're welcome," Karen replied, her voice still carrying traces of embarrassment. Would you and your mother like to come in for some iced tea? It's the least I can offer." Marcus glanced at his mother, unsure how to respond. Vanessa considered the invitation. Under normal circumstances, she would have politely declined and taken Marcus home after such an encounter. But her instincts told her this was an opportunity for something more significant than just avoiding an awkward situation. "We can stay for a short while," Vanessa agreed. "Marcus, is that okay with you?" "Sure, Mom," he said with a small shrug that conveyed his willingness to follow her lead. Karen's relief was visible as she led them into her home. The interior was beautifully maintained, with antique furniture that matched the historic character of the house. Family photos lined the hallway, Karen with older parents, Karen receiving awards, Karen volunteering at community events. In the kitchen, Karen busied herself preparing drinks while Vanessa and Marcus sat at the dining table. The silence was uncomfortable until Karen finally set down 3 glasses of iced tea and took a seat. "I owe you both a better explanation," Karen began, staring into her glass. "Not an excuse, but context for my behavior today." Vanessa nodded encouragingly, but remained silent, giving Karen space to continue. "My home was broken into 2 years ago," Karen said quietly. "I was at work, but knowing strangers have been in my house, touched my things. I haven't felt safe since. I installed security cameras, joined the neighborhood watch, became hypervigilant about unfamiliar people." Marcus listened attentively, his expression thoughtful. "That sounds frightening," Vanessa acknowledged. "Home invasions can be deeply traumatic." Karen nodded. "Yes, but..." She took a deep breath. "That doesn't justify what I did today. Your son gave me a perfectly reasonable explanation, showed me his ID, was nothing but polite, and I still called the police." "Why do you think that is?" Vanessa asked gently, her tone more therapist than interrogator. Karen's eyes filled with tears again. "Because I saw what I expected to see, not what was actually there." She looked directly at Marcus. "I'm truly sorry." Marcus set his glass down carefully. "Can I ask you something, Ms. Whitfield?" "Of course," Karen replied, looking surprised. "What would you have done differently if you could go back to this afternoon?" The question was simple but profound. Karen thought for a moment before answering. "I would have introduced myself properly, asked about your project with genuine interest, maybe even offered to show you some of the historical features of my home that might be good for your photographs." She shook her head sadly. "Basically, I would have treated you like any other student doing a school assignment." Marcus nodded. "That's all I wanted, to be seen as a student, not a threat." "People often don't realize how these encounters affect young people," Vanessa added. "Marcus has been stopped by security, followed in stores, questioned about being in certain neighborhoods more times than I can count. Each time chips away at his sense of belonging in his own community." Karen looked stricken. "I never thought about the cumulative effect." "Most people don't," Vanessa said. "That's why conversations like this one are so important." Marcus, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly smiled slightly. "Mom always turns everything into a teaching moment, even at home." This broke the tension, and Karen found herself smiling too. "I imagine having an FBI agent for a mother must be interesting." "You have no idea," Marcus chuckled. "Try explaining to your friends why your mom background checks your prom date." Vanessa laughed. "That was one time, and he had 3 suspicious social media accounts." The three of them shared a genuine moment of connection through humor, surprising all of them with how quickly the atmosphere had shifted. 3 weeks passed since the incident in Oakwood Heights. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Marcus hung his photography collection in Washington High School's art gallery. His teacher, Mrs. Daniels, helped him adjust the lighting on his centerpiece photo, a striking image of Karen Whitfield's colonial revival porch columns, with afternoon sunlight creating dramatic shadows across the intricate woodwork. "This is exceptional work, Marcus," Mrs. Daniels said, stepping back to admire the display. "The contrast between light and shadow really captures the historical essence while creating a modern artistic statement." Marcus smiled, feeling a genuine sense of pride. His project, titled Perspectives, Historic Architecture in Modern Contexts, had earned him the highest grade in class. But more importantly, it had become something much deeper than just a school assignment. "Thanks, Mrs. Daniels. I learned a lot working on this project, and not just about photography." Across town at the FBI Atlanta field office, Vanessa Johnson was finishing a presentation to her team. On the screen behind her was a slide that read, "Community Engagement Initiative, Building Trust Through Understanding." As federal agents, we're often seen as intimidating figures of authority, Vanessa had explained to the room full of agents. "Our new initiative aims to change that perception by actively participating in neighborhood forums, school programs, and community events." Agent Rodriguez, a newer member of the team, raised his hand. "What inspired this particular approach, Stacey Johnson?" Vanessa paused, considering how much of her personal experience to share. "A recent incident involving my son highlighted how crucial it is for law enforcement at all levels to be seen as partners in community safety, not just enforcers." After the meeting, Vanessa checked her phone to find a text message from an unexpected source. "Karen Whitfield. Just wanted to let you know that tonight's Neighborhood Association meeting approved the new Community Safety Committee unanimously. Thank you for your resources. Looking forward to seeing you and Marcus at the art show tomorrow." Vanessa smiled as she texted back a simple, "We'll be there." That evening, Marcus was putting final touches on his portfolio when his phone rang. It was Jamal. Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Jamal asked. "A little," Marcus admitted. "I didn't expect my school project to end up in a real gallery." "Man, you earned it." "Those photos are fire," Jamal said enthusiastically. "Plus, who would have thought that lady who called the cops on you would end up being your biggest supporter?" Marcus laughed. "Life is weird sometimes." The next day, downtown at the Prism Gallery, Karen Whitfield carefully arranged refreshments on a table near the entrance. Her brother David, the gallery owner, hung a banner that read "Emerging Talents, Youth Photography Showcase." "You didn't have to go all out like this, Karen," David said, adjusting the banner. "It's our regular student showcase, not a solo exhibition." Karen smoothed the tablecloth with nervous hands. "It's important to me that this goes well. These students deserve recognition." David studied his sister with curiosity. "You've changed since that incident you told me about. I'd never seen you so invested in a community project before." Karen paused, considering her brother's observation. "I had a wake-up call. Sometimes you don't realize how your actions affect others until you're forced to see things from a different perspective." By 6 o'clock, the gallery was filled with students, parents, art enthusiasts, and community members. Marcus's photographs had been given a prominent wall, and many visitors lingered in front of his work, commenting on his exceptional eye for detail and composition. Vanessa arrived in casual clothes rather than her usual FBI suit, wanting this evening to be about Marcus the photographer, not Marcus the FBI agent's son. She moved through the crowd, occasionally overhearing compliments about her son's talent that filled her with